Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I'm your host, John Jewett.
And I'm your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and deliver the highest level of competitors to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. Retaining the most muscle as possible during your fat loss or your contest prep is of high priority. A lot of times we do talk about just how to lose body fat on this aspect, and you get focused on that. But with regard to physique competition, it's not just about being as conditioned as possible. It's also about bringing the muscularity that you need within your division. So you also, all that hard-earned muscle that you created in the off season, you want to be able to showcase that on stage. So this is what we're diving into today. And this might be even a multi-part episode because there's so many variables that we could break down. So Luke and I today will just focus on the training piece, as there's already a lot of components just within that of what you can be doing to hold on to all that precious muscle tissue during a fat loss phase.
Yeah, I love the training piece. I think it's where I cut my teeth coming into the industry, and I think I always revert back to it because of that experience, and also because it just has the largest impact of like being the core driver for hypertrophy. And when we look at that as like the core stimulus for retention as well, I don't see why we wouldn't obsess over standardization of what we expect of our clients within someone's process. And so I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today as far as retaining tissue across a prep is largely like, what does the dynamic of the dialogue between coach and client need to look like as you continue across a prep? And then, program design changes and things along those lines. But one thing I see a lot, and I don't know if you see this as well, is as someone kind of gets into a prep, they're doing a lot more things. And so they're doing cardio and they're busier and there's more of their day taken away. So we start to see these training video footage, like the amount that gets sent and drop off. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes you could do, because if something starts to go wrong in the prep, I've found a lot of problems just by having that training footage of understanding how someone's outputting. So I do think I like starting with training for this series because it's such a core piece, and I think everything else is built off the back of how someone trains and what that dynamic of fatigue management looks like across the entire prep. And then we can start to talk about PDs, nutrition, and all that, and go from there.
I couldn't agree more. Like, training is what sets the stage and what we're almost building a lot of the other variables around, but also a lot of the other variables too are impacting what you can do training wise in turn. This could get into even like recovery capacity around sleep and stress management. It's going to, in turn impact the amount of stimulus you're able to give during a session. But with that being said too, like, the type of training will also dictate around what you're doing nutrition-wise and how you're changing training volume, or even having to pull back someone with the fatigue management point of view. But I think it's important that when we are entering prep, that we have standardized the quality of stimulus that we want on a per set basis, even a per rep basis. That way you're not entering into a prep and you, for one, have never seen this person train. And I feel like that is just common, because I know you're bringing up training footage, but at some point, this might not even be happening in the off season for a coach or a client, or if you're self-coaching, even looking at your own training, to where that needs to be in place before you even enter into prep. And hopefully you work these things out, because otherwise you have someone doing a form that is lacking accuracy, giving that stimulus to the muscle you want. And then you have like amount of volume that's there that's just not as productive as what it could be. And that amount of volume is also coming along with a concomitant amount of fatigue. And so now you're in a situation where you could in a fat loss phase with the recovery variables going down, a higher training volume, and it's higher because the stimulus is lesser quality per set, but it's generating a substantially more higher amount of fatigue. And so what does that run into? Well, that's going to run into then hitting a bottleneck in their prep of, for one, fatigue too high, have to pull them back, but also potential for larger losses of lean body mass just because the stimulus isn't that great. So what we really want to do is get the most stimulus per set basis and to where you won't need so many sets to hold on to that tissue. And in turn, you'd be a lot better with managing fatigue. If you're not as fatigued, guess what? You can also you could run a more aggressive fat loss phase, but even then, like the percentage of fat you're losing relation to muscle will be far greater. And now you're going to bring up, people might be thinking, well, I'm running PDs, I'm not losing any muscle. Be it, how about you grow into the show? Like whatever you want it to be, like either way, it's going to be a better situation for you. If that's recomping, which is rare, not losing muscle or just losing less muscle, like it's all going to be better if you can improve that quality stimulus. But the training piece, and you can get into this, Luke, of what do you see change wise and also psychological wise? Is it more so the people that are emotionally tied to like the logbook, and how do they disassociate from that in prep? Like what are the things to be focusing on?
Yeah. So like, as we start to get into what changes, like I think the general conversation is just overall doing less, like as far as like the amount of stimulus provided, how long the sessions get, total number of sets performed across a week to kind of match where they're at from a recovery capacity standpoint. As output and increases and the food drops and the deficit increases, that's pretty standard, right? I think psychological management of these various different clients are kind of where you really start to shine as a coach. And to your point, like the logbooker, right? The person who is emotionally attached to the logbook in a contest prep setting, they'll do anything they can to manage continuing to progress that logbook or even potentially just match, where their decision-making process starts to really go out the window with that being the sole purpose. And that decision-making process being, as we mentioned, maintaining the standard of execution. I've even seen it where I've had clients go rogue off plan and do high days to maintain that training performance without telling me during a prep. So like there's levels of this psychological bias, but like on the extreme end of like psychological bias, making decisions around other variables that influence training because of that emotional attachment without understanding that there's other reasons why we wouldn't need to be doing that. But that'd be the first case. And so with that client, we largely need to save them from themselves. And that's where this training footage is so valuable, because if we see this decline into effort increasing, but output not really increasing, which you're clearly seeing, like the failure rep or the last rep goes from, completed on their own to spotted to dumped in the bottom of a hack squat, and that progresses across a prep. It's like you're not actually progressively training, you're just changing the effort at which you train, and in turn providing more fatigue. And so that's where we save those people a lot of times through the training footage. And then we can start to understand why we may be seeing subjective metrics decline or fat loss slow if that has been present kind of throughout the prep. Now, the other reason is I have seen exhaustion across a prep pull someone away from their ability to train. So the opposite end of the spectrum. So they start cutting sets short or stopping a couple reps in reserve without that being a part of the plan because of the mental fatigue associated with prepping. Which again, if you have someone who biases training towards training at close proximity to failure their entire career, and they get to a point in prep where they start subconsciously pulling back from that, there's change that needs to occur. And so when we start to get into and that's why I make it so important, is because around the training footage is because it's how you pick up on it the quickest. If it's a constant across the entire prep, you can pick up on it before they're even able to verbalize it. And then we can start to get into changing exercise selection or changing volume or even potentially pulling back from failure purposely as we go through this. So what I'd like to hear from you is what is the first change you typically see when you see the ability to recover start to kind of drop? Because there's a couple ways to go about it, but what do you think would be the first thing you would change when you kind of start to see that happen?
Yeah. Before I hit that, I want to go back to something you brought up, because I think this is an in the gym moment that's very hard to differentiate from for one, the balance of effort and accuracy within a set, but
it's
also
so
the perception of effort versus actual relative effort, right? And I think like this is where the rep and reserve thing could be very problematic for someone that's training in a prep, because you have this, how many reps away from failure are you? Well, there's a true metric of this, right? Like mechanically what you can do. But if you're have more fatigue present, you might be even more inaccurate in gauging this. Now, I don't know of any research around that even has looked into this. Does your perception of your RRR change with higher levels of fatigue in a dieting state? Some amazing PhD out there. There's your, hypothesis, statement. You're to investigate. But I would say just anecdotally off coaching, it does. And so you very easily could have someone that is now training farther from failure just because their perceived fatigue is higher. And so this is where I kind of lean more into, letting like the logbook and even high effort training with pretty much taking it all the way, like all the reps you can get on your own, just let that be standardized, because then there's no doubt that fatigue is masking that. But the issue is when it's not the effort piece, but it's the accuracy piece. So because the effort one is very hard to gauge, so I rather just, hey, take it all the way, make that set high quality stimulus. But when we're seeing like the detriment in forms changing on the last rep, and that's what I'm always looking for, is like, how do you alter your reps on those last ones just to keep it moving? Now that's a case of where you are just trying to alter your form to match a rep, even though you're just trying to train harder by speeding through reps. But training harder doesn't mean, and altering the lift isn't the same as just giving at that same standardized effort level that we want to see. So I think when you're trading off some accuracy and also trying to give a different type of effort that's inaccurate is where it becomes really problematic. And we start seeing just a far exponential greater rise of fatigue. Also, joint connective tissue issues start to creep up too, because you're altering your form and mechanics to continue lifting, which is probably getting into suboptimal positions for what you should be setting up for your own like joints and mechanics in these lifts. So that's where, like, for me, I'm still the proponent of like taking the effort all the way and letting the logbook help guide that as well. Okay. But also having the emotional control in your mind to not alter your form. And if it's not there for the day and you miss a rep, you don't change what you do, standardized effort, execution wise, just to get that extra rep. But then you use that logbook as the diagnostic tool of like, okay, performance is declining. What do you do from there? And so this comes back now, circle back to your other question of, we are truly seeing some first decline in performance. What do you do training management wise? And this is assuming like all the other variables that Luke might get into the other podcasts around sleep, stress, nutrition, all the rate of loss, all these things are already checked off to where it's only training left, and you have someone that has some decline. What do you do about it? And I would say, first off, where's the decline? Are we talking about, this is on my leg day, my squat has dropped back, but all my leg press, my leg extension, my leg curls are holding well? Well, this isn't a total systemic fatigue issue. I would say this isn't even a local fatigue issue. I would say it's more of a bracing issue, with being like a squat, for instance, something that requires a lot of internal bracing. And so if you have that core that's now, that waist size is getting smaller, you simply won't be as efficient of transmitting force into that bar. And so that lift very well might drop off. And Luke's made the statement like weight moves weight. So when you're at a higher body weight, some of those movements like a deadlift or a squat, those could be the first to take a hit. And just because they do doesn't mean that you're not still giving a good stimulus to the target muscle. You just have to still differentiate in your mind that external load doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as what you experience at the fiber level. So if I'm seeing it on one lift, I'm not sweating it. We just keep that effort and form standardized and realize like, hey, this is probably more of a drop off just from body weight shift. Now, those movement patterns, Luke, would that be the first that you start making adjustments when you see those drops just from a safety and fatigue management standpoint? Or are you kind of waiting till, hey, across this session, like people are starting to report back? Usually what I'll hear back is like, man, the weights are really hard to maintain this week, the loads and the reps, kind of across the board. So will that be the time you switch to exercise? Would you already have done that? Or what would be your kind of next action step from there?
Yeah, so this has changed for me a bit recently, semi-recently, last 6 months or so, I would say. Almost the first change I make heading into prep is the exercise selection one, like preemptively trying to combat this from happening. And the reason being is because depending on how movement change occurs, there's always a learning curve to a new movement being plugged in. So like, depending on if if you transfer from a safety bar squat to a hack squat or a pendulum squat, right? They're different squat patterns. Your pelvis moves differentially relative to where loads placed in the foot. And so there's going to be a learning curve of how to exert force back into the floor relative to where that load is, right? 3, 4, 5 weeks, that learning process is still going to take up some sort of mental capacity in order to do that. And so I'm trying to avoid that as much as possible by preemptively moving these movements at the start of prep into variations I think they can maintain throughout the entirety of prep. Where in the past, when we've talked about this in previous podcasts, I would kind of wait for it to happen. And the reason I do this now is because rather than the change mid-prep being the change in movement selection, the change in prep is deprioritization of a pattern that they can't maximally output in. So if bracing is the issue, that's the rate limiter for output within a squat pattern, then I could move it later in the session where the amount that they can get of their maximal output is higher because now the total relative load is less. So a bunch of fancy words for saying, if you can pendulum squat 7 plates at the start of a session, if you did pendulum squat after a leg press, you're probably not going to be able to do 7 plates. You're probably going to be doing more like 6 plates, maybe 5 1/4 for the same rep range. Now bracing is less of the issue because the total relative load to create the mechanical tension stimulus is less. And so now I've kept the quality of the stimulus there, and then now leg press is not going to have a bracing issue. And so that's kind of more the change I started to make recently, trying to avoid learning new movements mid-prep is kind of where.
Someone might pose the argument like, say that pendulum, right? It loads, the quad more lengthened, or your squat pattern does in general, that you might have the best quality stimulus in the beginning of the session, and now moving it to the end of the session, although the your ability to brace is better, the quad could be more pre-fatigued, and you might not be getting as much stimulus per set now out of that squat pattern as well. So I guess is that trade-off worth it? Like moving it towards the end of the session, or and we kind of know this, like the exercise order might not be as big of an issue around the hypertrophy stimulus versus just programming it from a safety standpoint. Like when you kind of sum up the results, so we can talk in theory a lot about loading and the tension level and different ranges, but it might just kind of add up to not being too meaningful. Yeah,
I think a lot of times too, like if you're using a 45-degree leg press, like you're not sacrificing length and loading too much, really, right? If you're using
depends on the mechanics of of someone like a
it does largely, but I wouldn't say that's the default change though. That's an as needed change, because there's people who will run that same session set up the entirety of prep and not have an issue. It's more like managing a problem, right? It's not that every prep has that change. It's that if there's a problem present, we need to manage the situation to get the most out of the athlete. And that's kind of a better way I found to get more out of an athlete.
Well, one thing you brought up too that I think he brought up, like the learning curve, and again, like if you're really advanced, like moving to a hack squat
really
from
small.
a squat, it is small. But what I would say is that the load that you're able to move now, it will have you more cautious for a lot of people. Like I just know even for myself, like if I go to a pattern, even though it's braced, like right now I do a Roger squat and a pendulum squat, but I haven't done the hack squat in a while. So if in mid prep, I'm just going to jump to the hack squat. I'm going to just have in my mind to not jump all the way out to what I have been in the past. And so in turn, that stimulus is already going to be lower until I'm like back up comfortable to the load that I'm used to doing. It's not necessarily the learning curve to it, but it's more of like my own self-regulation to prevent injury from happening, which is a consideration for a lot of guys. So I think you make a good point of like bringing that in early enough. You have someone that can progress up the lift and get those early, if it is neurological adaptations away, if it's a learning piece there, but also the psychological aspects out of the way of getting them just comfortable with the lift again.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where my thought process of removing a governor off an athlete is why I make that change. Like I'm trying to keep that governor from coming on someone, right? And so if I can leave that governor off, I can just let an athlete be an athlete, and then I can worry about managing the fatigue by appropriately managing the volume in the session, which would then be my next move. Is like, okay, is the total stimulus provided across the entirety of the program too much? And then what is the source of that too much stimulus? Is frequency still too high, or is it just total volume per session? Most of the time, because of the way I run the pre-prep phase into prep, I'm removing frequency in that to get out of specialization into more generalized programming across a contest prep, where frequency is not typically the issue during prep. It's typically just the length of session and the total sets per body part.
Yeah. I think like at least initially, usually it's making just some slight reductions in volume. It's usually like the first move if the exercise order has already been set up in a good spot. In general, I think I've kept the training split relatively the same, so that I don't change the frequency of which that volume is laid out. And so just pulling back a little bit, I think across like some preps, it's not much. It's really not. I mean, you might have a 20 to 30% reduction in volume in certain areas, right? Like there's going to be certain body parts that are already lower in volume that I don't need to mess with, or ones that are higher and more taxing days that I bring down. So I like to ask the client too around like which days are you feeling the most taxed on, which exercises are you feeling the most taxed on, and kind of let some of that biofeedback help guide that as well. So I don't want to make just assumptions, but I can see like how we log like with our coaching app. When they start their session, it'll give us like session duration times. So I can see if someone's like having a really long training session. Towards the end of prep is when you see the stamina start dropping off. So the beginning can start off strong, but it's usually the tail end of the session. It just gets really poor quality stimulus, and also just starts really accumulating fatigue quickly. So that's the case like later in prep where I won't reduce the volume, but I'll just spread it out to where it's shorter sessions. I might increase the amount of training days, which I've done this on myself, move from like 5 days a week to 6 days a week. Volume's the same across the week. It's just shorter sessions, which is much more manageable from a fatigue aspect, and keeping the training stimulus high, which is what's going to keep muscle tissue on you.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I think that's kind of where, when we look at like the prep management situation, it's so case to case. It's like the generalities of this is remove stimulus in the form that allows the athlete to continue performance metrics and subjectively be able to kind of handle the duration of prep. Because there are cases that I've seen where people have pulled out of prep because the schedule component for them changed so much from like what it took to actually get in shape on the cardio, nutrition, activity side, that the training dynamic has to kind of alter to allow them to be able to do the things for fat loss that are necessary.
Yeah, and that'll get into the other variables, right? Like if you're managing the other variables really well, you'll have productive fat loss and be able to retain a lot of the training performance there and not have to make major adjustments. But flip for the other person that is, I don't know, maybe they're a shift worker and they have a busy schedule, sleep is crap, They also are more resistant to fat loss just in general because of their lifestyle, but also maybe genetically, to where you have to run a pretty aggressive program for them. And managing training performance in that person, it's very, very challenging, to where if you have to pull back so much, you're now just not in a stimulus level that's going to be retaining much tissue. Like it'll be there, but it's usually a person you might see at the end of prep where body weight moves down, but they're not getting harder. You're like, oh man, what does this make sense? It's like, yeah, it's like the stress variable, the recovery aspect is not there, to where they are just truly losing tissue, even with the PDs and everything in place. Like you can't out drug a poor not even nutrition, but just a poor environment, really, for that level of fat loss to get stage lean. Because I've had those guys, especially shift workers, like, man, to get them stage lean, it's very challenging. People do it. Don't get me wrong. If you're a shift worker, you're like, no, I got lean. There's ones that just, you hit the wall with them and they just don't move anymore because of that. But the training piece, yeah, it can get pretty low. But if you're also managing your other variables really well, there won't be much change across the entire prep for your training. It's just some slight reductions in volume. I think for instance, I'll use Renee because I broke down her prep on our physique coach curriculum, and for her prep, I think we had one chunk of prep where we pulled her back for 4 days from training, because this is another component of it, of when someone does get a little too far and you need to do a deload or extra rest days, what do you do to really drop off the fatigue variable? And for me, it's what's the shortest time I can spend in removing fatigue to get back to productive fat loss. So there's not you're going to deload for 7 days on prep or 4 days on prep, or it's purely down to looking at a daily auto regulation to get that person back to fat loss. So someone hits the wall, you're like, oh man, it's time to pull them back. Usually for them, it's immediate full rest days. And then maybe there's a training session that's going to be dialed back, 50% volume, a few rep shy of failure, and then we're right back at it. And then I think we did one of those for Renee, and early in prep, there might've been a day where we had an extra rest day in place, but this was across a 17-week prep. That was all that was needed to keep her moving. Well, someone else, you might have to toggle with pulling back on having rest days put in more often, or things like that to manage fatigue. But when you have someone with the lifestyle that caters well to prep and bodybuilding, you won't have to do nearly as much.
Yeah, I will say, and the deload structure for me prep wise is way more aggressive than it is off season, because just with this type of stuff we put out, psychologically, a large percentage of my clients love to train. And so it's hard for them to get out of the gym. So for those people that are that way, it's hard to say, hey, I need you out of the gym for 3 days. But for a prep, it's very valuable because you're rinsing it off so quick that I think it's the way to go about it. Now, general fatigue management, I will hit a point in the very back end stages of prep where I do introduce RIR on major compound lifts, especially within leg training. I don't see that across the board in every client case, but I do see that in quite a few where we've all been there. It's just the leg day digs you in such a hole, and you get home, you sit down and you just fall asleep and you just can't do anything the rest of the day. It's when in a prep, when it's getting to that point where now that's carrying over into the following session, there is value in potentially keeping someone away from failure in those leg compounds or major compounds the last few weeks. I'd say that's probably the last 3 or 4 weeks for most people, in order to just keep them alive kind of throughout the back end of prep, where body fat's the lowest and it's the harshest place to be.
Yeah, and speaking to that, of RIR, I think the final time that we will run into, which probably wraps us up. I know we're getting into, we spoke mainly about fat loss, but then if eventually fat loss is over and we're running into peak week, someone's already ahead, is for one, if you're already ahead, I usually hold training relatively the same. As food comes up, just training performance starts increasing on its own. And I don't do anything else differently, but still, like, either way, into peak week, I deload the sessions with just a big drop in volume and keeping someone farther away from failure. Even though someone has been eating more into the show, they're ready ahead, they've dropped off some fatigue, being at that depleted state, either way, there's still usually more I see that could be brought out for a lot of people, just by a complete fatigue reduction. And again, it's not a set like must be 7 days out, but I usually go at least the week of peak week or a few days before the show, dialing back training quite a bit, and that's will lead them to stage. So that kind of wraps up I think the topic fully, unless there's something else you want to hit.
No. I just, it's where prep starts. It's the core center of prep. And so it needs to be obsessed over so much. I don't see how you couldn't and manage the prep well.
It's amazing when you have people that just, they're so hands off from the training piece. Yes. What is the most important piece? Like my internal monologue that happens during training, it's determining like everything on plan. Like I want my clients to be able to express that dialogue back to me in some degree, but it's also a teaching point of them knowing to pick up and relay that information and communicate it and also remember it. So it was like, oh yeah, training was good today. It was like, is that all you thought about while you train? Like, no, like think about that internal monologue you're having with yourself of like, man, that set like really pushed me. Like, let me pull back this load here, or I'm going to really go for it. Like that's the type of stuff you want to be relaying to your coach. He doesn't want a story of your whole session, but again, pick out the important pieces so you can relay of where you're struggling in your training, what might be connecting poorly or driving more fatigue, but to be able to, if your coach was sitting there with you, what kind of conversation would you have? That's what you want to relay back, because those are some of the most important pieces to managing someone on prep.
Yeah, 100%. I've got really nothing to add. I think it's so integral for that dialogue to be so clear that do everything you have to make sure it's clear between client and coach.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Any questions on training, or if you have another topic around retaining tissue that you have like some specific questions on, leave them down below and Luke and I can make sure we hit them in the next episode. But until then, we will talk to you then.